Antonio Guterres speaking in New York. Well, let's go to Tel Aviv now. We're joined by Mark Regev, who's a senior advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister. He's also a former Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom. Mark Regev, welcome to BBC News.
Thank you for having me, Liz.
What in particular has angered Israel about the comments in a vacuum? It does seem obvious that this particular crisis, as to use it as unprecedented as it is in every way, has come against the backdrop of decades of Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Arab crises, including Israel's continuing occupation of Palestinian territories. What is it that has made Israel so angry?
Well, first of all, as you know better than most, Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip in 2005. We withdrew. We took down the settlements and we
your troops
evacuated.
Your troops, yes.
Yes, we took down the settlements and we redeployed behind the 1967 line. And yet none of that is seemingly recalled by the Secretary General. And more so, he talked about, the lack of a progress on peace. But you know and I know that Hamas has been the most bitter and violent opponent of peace and reconciliation. They say my country has no right to exist in any borders. They say any Arab who signs a peace agreement with Israel is a traitor to the cause, and you know what needs to be done to traitors. They say that the only path is not negotiation, the only path is terrorism, is violence. And so for him to say, well, Hamas is killing us because there's no politics, the peace process has been stifled, that's simply not true. In fact, when the peace process was moving ahead, you'll recall, both of us are old enough to remember the Oslo years in the 1990s. And then there was a whole wave of Hamas suicide bombings, and then we were told Hamas is killing Jews because they want to stop peace. And now the Secretary General is telling us today Hamas is killing Jews because there is no peace. I'm sorry. Hamas kills us because that's their raison d'etre. That's who they are. They are a disgusting, extreme, barbaric organization. And anyone who had any doubts just saw the violence that Israelis experienced on that terrible October 7th, Saturday morning.
I'm sure there are now discussions behind the scenes with Antonio Guterres and senior Israeli diplomats about what the Secretary General really wanted to say when he made those remarks. But let's look at the consequences of it. It seems to be quite an unprecedented move to deny visas to UN officials. We understand even the UN's humanitarian chief, Martin Griffiths, may not be able to visit. Won't that actually make it even worse in your efforts to try to work with the United Nations?
Well, the United Nations has to show itself to be a reasonable partner here. And we've in the past worked with Secretary Generals and worked with the UN effectively on numerous issues. But I'd remind you that two of the current Secretary General's predecessors, both Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon, publicly addressed the issue of institutional structural anti-Israel bias in the UN. This Secretary General has not done so. He seems to have adopted and embraced that structural and organizational bias against my country.
Antonio Guterres spoke at length at the UN Security Council. He also emphasized what we understand one Western leader, a friend of Israel, has said on their visits to Israel, in that there is, even in war, there are rules. And he mentioned this to Israel, but he also mentioned it to Hamas, who he accused of using civilians as human shields. So as the world's top diplomat, he seems to be looking at both sides of this war and asking both sides to meet their international obligations.
On the contrary, he's making an artificial symmetry between a democratic country that is acting to protect its people after we've experienced the most brutal act of violence, the worst terrorist incident since 9/11 and the worst act of anti-Semitic violence since 1945. He's making a symmetry between that and between bloodthirsty terrorists who rape and burn people alive. And it's been reported on the BBC. I don't need to restate all the things that Hamas did on that terrible Saturday morning. There is no symmetry. And by drawing a symmetry, I think he's made a terrible mistake, and he's hurt his own reputation and that of the United Nations. I would remind you that we've had a whole host of world leaders who've come to Israel, the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the President of France, the Chancellor of Germany. Today we've got two European leaders, the Austrian and the Czech Prime Minister. Everyone is coming here And they are unequivocally, they're not saying it happened in a vacuum like the Secretary General, they're unequivocally condemning Hamas's behavior. That is what the international community needs to do. And of course, we want to do what we can to minimize civilian casualties. Of course, we want to work on the humanitarian effort with the relevant organizations. But this artificial symmetry, it is simply morally, politically unacceptable.
But just briefly, I mean, even your best of friends, Joe Biden, who was the first to come to be seen to be standing beside Israel, he also made comments saying you have to be careful of civilians, you have to allow aid to enter Gaza. Many have been giving you messages without establishing what you have described as symmetry. It's possible to have many messages at the same time.
I agree. And of course, we heed what President Biden and our other friends are saying. Of course, Israel works within the framework of international law. Of course, Israel wants to minimize harm to the civilian population of Gaza. Of course, we are targeting Hamas and not Gaza's civilians. But when people are saying it's the same, that when a civilian is inadvertently caught up in the crossfire between us and Hamas, that's the same as butchering, as raping, burning children alive, the sort of things Hamas does. There is no symmetry. The German Chancellor, when he was here a few days ago, he made a comparison between Hamas and the Nazis. World leaders have said they're like ISIS, worse than ISIS, because ISIS didn't burn children alive. ISIS didn't do the sort of atrocities that Hamas committed. And yet the Secretary General is saying it's a clean playing field. Sorry, it's not a clean playing field. There is a clear aggressor here, a clear victim here, and Israel was attacked unprovoked. There is no justification, and that is what should be expected of the leader of the largest and most important international organization.
Very briefly, because we're running out of time, Mark Regev, just briefly, are you going to let fuel in if the United Nations gives ironclad assurances that they will handle it?
So as you know, Liz, we're helping to bring in water, food and medicine. Fuel is problematic because fuel is what Hamas wants for its war machine, for its rockets, for its tunnels, underground terror network, and we'll be fighting that terror network shortly. And so we need to make sure they don't get the fuel for their military machine. I tell you, and I know for a fact, there are hundreds of thousands of liters of petrol, of fuel inside the Gaza Strip as we speak. Hamas has it. Surely Hamas can release some of that for Gaza's hospitals.
Mark Regev, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you very much for joining us. Mark Regev is senior advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He's also a former Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom, making it clear why Israel is so angry with the UN Secretary General and why it won't allow fuel into Gaza. We'll continue our special coverage of this crisis, but for now, I'll hand you back to the